the stillness of a cold morning, a millionaire spots a collapsed black teen and 3 freezing children huddled on a park bench. He could have called for help and walked away, but instead, he takes them home. What unfolds is not charity, but defiance. Witness the power of unseen resilience. Where are you watching from, and is it morning, noon, or late at night where you are? It was the kind of morning that rarely drew attention. The park was quiet, the air crisp with only a few birds rustling in the trees overhead and the occasional jogger passing by. Herbert Richardson, a reclusive billionaire in his late 60s, had taken to walking here before sunrise, away from headlines, and investors away from the sharp clang of boardroom politics. He walked slowly, not for exercise, but to think. Hands buried deep in the pockets of his gray wool coat, his gaze drifted to the worn path ahead. On this particular morning, he wasn't looking for anything, but something found him. Under a gnarled oak tree near a weather-worn bench, Herbert caught sight of a bundle on the wooden slats. At first glance, it looked like discarded clothes or forgotten blankets, the kind of thing that sadly wasn't rare in this part of the city. He walked past it at first, just a few steps, but something inside him whispered for a second look. He turned back. The pile shifted. His breath caught. He stepped closer. What he saw forced his chest to tighten. A young girl, barely more than a teenager, lay unconscious, her back curled inward, one arm dangling off the edge of the bench. Her clothes were torn, stained with city dust. Her cheeks were sunken, her skin pale, and her breathing was faint but present. Clutched tightly in her arms was a small child, a girl perhaps 5 years old, with wide eyes open but eerily still. She didn't cry. She just held on to the girl's torn jacket with both hands. On the ground beside them, wrapped in flimsy cloth, were 2 infants. Their cheeks were flushed with cold, their tiny fists clenched, and their soft cries barely reached the morning air. Herbert stood frozen. Years ago, he might have panicked, maybe even called someone else to handle it. That was before Jessie, before grief pulled him into a silence so thick it never quite left. Jessie, his only child, had drowned at 7 years old. He hadn't been there when it happened. He was at a conference in Berlin, and he had returned to find only questions he could never answer. Since then, he avoided children, not out of dislike, but because he couldn't face the pain of seeing someone else's child smile when his couldn't anymore. But this morning, something cracked. He knelt slowly. The girl didn't stir. The little girl, clinging to her chest, looked up at him, her lips trembling. "My sister is sleeping," she whispered, her voice dry, brittle. "But the babies are cold." Herbert didn't hesitate. He checked the teenager's pulse, relieved to find it there, faint but steady. The babies were alive too, but their lips were tinged with blue. They needed warmth. Now. His phone was in his hand, thumb hovering over the screen. The emergency number blinked back at him. Call an ambulance. That's what a good citizen would do. That's what protocol demanded. But Herbert had spent decades watching the system move slowly, especially when it came to people who didn't look like him. He had stood by when social services failed children. He had been too late before. Not this time. He didn't call. Instead, he bent down and lifted the babies one by one into the crook of his arms. He gently hoisted the young woman over his shoulder. Alma, the little girl, followed, her tiny legs stumbling to keep up. Passing pedestrians stared. Some slowed down, others frowned. An elderly white man in a tailored coat carrying a homeless black girl and 2 infants. The image confused them. A few whispered. No one offered to help. No one asked if everything was all right. Herbert didn't look at them. He moved quickly to his car. An old Lincoln he parked off the main street and laid them gently inside. He turned the heat up, glanced at the rear view mirror, and saw Alma clutching one baby, her lips pressed to its forehead. "You did good," he said softly, unsure if she heard him. She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the unconscious girl. Herbert drove with a steady urgency, his hands tight on the wheel. When the gates of his mansion opened, the gravel crunched beneath his tires. The house was quiet ivy crawling up its stone sides, the windows wide and dark. This place had not known the sound of children in decades. It had known silence. Too much of it. Beatrix Mitchell had worked for Herbert for over 20 years. She knew when he had a bad board meeting, when he missed Jessie, when the nights were too quiet. But she had never, in all those years, seen what she saw when the front door flew open. Herbert, flushed from exertion, stood with 2 infants in his arms, a girl on his back, and a child at his side. Beatrix gaped. "Dear Lord," she muttered. "Mr. Richardson, what on earth?" blankets, warm water, and call Dr. Johnson, he said, quickly, walking past her without waiting for a response. Beatrix followed her slippers slapping against the marble. Are they hurt? Who are they? I don't know, he said, laying the teenager on the couch, then placing the babies by the fireplace. But they need help now. Beatrix saw it in his eyes, the urgency, the fear, the weight of something unspoken. She didn't argue. She moved. Within minutes, the room was alive with motion. Warm towels, bottles, heated formula, soft lights. Dr. Johnson arrived 20 minutes later, a man in his 50s, always efficient, always polite. He raised an eyebrow when he saw the scene. Mr. Richardson, he said cautiously, wouldn't it have been better to take them to the ER? No, Herbert replied flatly. They wouldn't have made it through the wait. Just look at them. Dr. Johnson examined the infants first. They were cold, malnourished but responsive. The teenagers' vitals were weak, dehydrated, malnourished, exhausted. The man sighed. They need care, but they'll survive, he said. You want me to call child services? Herbert shook his head. Not yet. You know that's the protocol. Not this time. The doctor glanced at Beatrix, who said nothing, only nodded slightly. After a long pause, Johnson began unpacking his bag. As the fire crackled and the sky outside began to brighten, the mansion was no longer silent. It was filled with the faint sounds of life, a baby's cough, the rustle of blankets, the soft hum of Beatrix heating milk. And in the middle of it all stood Herbert, still in his coat, still trying to understand what had just happened. For the first time in a very long while, the house did not feel empty. It felt uncertain, and yet somehow right. And that was just the beginning. The warmth inside the house didn't come from the fire alone. It came from the urgency in the air, from the shift that had begun to ripple through the cold silence of Herbert Richardson's long-closed life. Beatrix Mitchell stood at the base of the staircase, arms folded over her apron, her eyes tracking every movement with a quiet, measured intensity. She wasn't a woman who startled easily. In her years managing this household, she'd dealt with foreign diplomats, tense boardroom meetings, even Jesse's adolescent storms. But nothing prepared her for the image of her employer hauling a teenage girl, 2 infants, and a child into the house before sunrise. She watched the medical kit spread across the coffee table, the infant bottles warming on the kitchen counter, and Dr. Johnson's face tightening with quiet disapproval. You brought them here, Beatrix asked, not accusatory but needing to understand. Herbert, still wearing his coat, stood near the fireplace. He didn't look at her. He was watching the girl on the couch, her breathing more even now, her head resting against a folded towel. I didn't know where else to take them, he said simply. The hospital, perhaps, doctor. Johnson added dryly, without lifting his head from checking the infant's heartbeat. I made a choice, Herbert said. They didn't have time to wait. Dr. Johnson glanced up, then face unreadable. And if she's underage, this could be a legal matter. We can worry about legalities once she's breathing properly. The tone in Herbert's voice wasn't harsh, but it allowed no space for argument. Beatrix stepped forward, folding down the edge of the blanket wrapped around the smaller twin. They're not just cold. These babies haven't had proper food in days. They're in starvation mode, Johnson added. Not irreversible, but delicate. Herbert nodded. His eyes landed briefly on Alma, who sat quietly at the foot of the couch. She hadn't spoken since they arrived. She held one of the baby's tiny socks in her hand like a talisman. Her expression wasn't blank. It was focused, like she was memorizing every detail of the room, every adult movement, weighing who she could trust. Jessie used to do that, Herbert remembered. Back when her mother brought her to meetings at the old vineyard, Jessie would scan the room like she was reading a book with no pictures. Beatrix straightened up and moved toward the kitchen. We'll need more formula, diapers, something for the girl when she wakes up. Dr. Johnson packed away his tools and wrote something in a small notepad. You should notify Child Protective Services, Mr. Richardson. Not yet. Herbert said again. Let her wake up first. Johnson hesitated. That's not standard protocol. Herbert's stare was steady. Neither was finding a child nearly frozen on a public bench. There was a long silence. Finally, the doctor tucked the notepad back into his coat and adjusted his scarf. I'll check in later. Call if anything changes. When the door closed behind him, the house felt fuller, not louder, but more alive. Herbert sat down slowly across from the couch. Alma's eyes followed him. What's your name? He asked. She didn't answer right away. She looked at Claire, then at her brothers. Alma. He nodded. That's a beautiful name. Do you know how old you are? 5, and the babies, Ben and Ryan. "They're little." Beatrix returned with warm bottles. "Would you like to help me feed them?" Alma nodded slowly. She held the bottle awkwardly at first, but carefully. As she did, her shoulders relaxed just a bit. She wasn't used to kindness. That much was clear. Later, while the children slept and the sun rose higher, Beatrix pulled Herbert aside in the hallway near the conservatory. The morning light spilled through the tall windows, dust particles drifting in the silence between them. "This isn't like you," she said. Not unkindly. "Taking in strangers." Herbert's voice was low. "She looked like Jessie once." Beatrix softened but didn't let up. "And when the authorities come asking questions, we answer them truthfully. But not today. Today we keep them alive." Beatrix nodded once and returned to the kitchen. She was loyal, but practical. This choice would ripple through the rest of their lives, and she knew it. But she also knew Herbert never acted on impulse. If he had brought them home, he had already decided. For the rest of the morning, the mansion shifted. What had once been a quiet, echoing estate became a place of movement. Diapers were changed. Formula was made. Alma clung to Claire even as she slept. Herbert didn't return to his office. He didn't read the news. He sat in the parlor, listening to the sound of breathing, watching for the girl to stir. The light coming in through the tall windows had softened into a golden hue, stretching quietly across the polished floors of the Richardson house. The air was warm, now thick with the scent of herbal tea, baby lotion, and the faint trace of wood smoke lingering from the fireplace. In the parlor, the hush of the house was broken only by the occasional rustle of a blanket or a soft sigh from one of the infants napping nearby. Claire lay beneath a woolen throw on the large couch, her body still and face pale, but the tension that had clung to her like a second skin was beginning to shift. Her breath, though shallow, had slowed to a more regular rhythm. Beside her, Alma sat curled in a wing-back chair, knees pulled close to her chest, clutching a thin teddy bear that Beatrix had found upstairs in a forgotten box of old toys. The child had barely spoken since Claire had calmed, and the silence around her was not a peaceful one. It was full of listening, watching, waiting. When Claire stirred again, her eyelids fluttered like they were reluctant to open. Her brow furrowed before her eyes could focus, her mind waking faster than her limbs. Her breathing quickened, and her hand shot out instinctively, searching for something she could not see yet. "Alma!" Her voice cracked thin and broken as her body jerked upright. Her eyes were wide, scanning the room, locking onto the child in the chair. "They're okay," Alma whispered. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. She didn't move, only tightened her arms around the teddy bear. "We're not outside anymore." Claire blinked, confused. Her mind hadn't caught up. Her hand went to her chest, then to the edge of the couch, grounding herself. The last thing she remembered was a park bench, cold wind, a baby crying, and the numbness crawling into her spine. Now she was here in a room with soft furniture and clean air, with a fire behind her and light that didn't burn. Her heartbeat kicked harder. She threw off the blanket and tried to stand. "Where are they?" Her voice was stronger now. Her body shook, but her legs pushed forward anyway. Beatrix was already stepping into the room. "Easy, sweetheart. They're right here. The boys are sleeping, and Alma hasn't left your side." Claire turned, backing toward the nearest wall. Her eyes darted between the unfamiliar faces, her breathing shallow. Beatrix approached slowly, hands visible, her tone calm. "You fainted in the park. Mr. Richardson found you and brought you here." Claire shook her head, disoriented. "Who, that would be me," came the voice from the hallway. Herbert entered the room without rush. He had changed into a navy sweater and soft brown trousers, no longer the heavy coat and scarf. His posture was steady, hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't come too close. "I saw you. You were unconscious. I thought you needed help." Claire's eyes flicked back to Alma. The girl gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. Claire exhaled her knees, giving in just enough to catch herself on the wall. "I thought they would take them," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. Her voice cracked again. I thought someone would think I did something wrong." "You didn't," Herbert said. "No one said anything like that." Claire covered her face with one hand. We were just trying to stay warm. I wasn't trying to get anything. I didn't ask for anything. And no one's asking you to." Beatrix said, her voice firm but kind. "You and the little ones are safe here. That's all that matters." Claire looked at her, really looked. Then she looked back at Herbert. Her breathing slowed. "I'm sorry we caused trouble. I just need a little time, until the babies are better. Then we can go." Herbert nodded. "You don't need to decide anything right now. You need rest." She didn't sit back down, but her shoulders sagged. The adrenaline was running out. Her hand reached toward Alma, who rushed forward and wrapped her arms around her sister's waist. "I thought you weren't going to wake up," Alma said into her side. "Like Mom." Claire's face changed, her arms wrapped around the girl, eyes brimming. She crouched down, pulling her close, burying her face in Alma's tangled hair. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here, baby." Beatrix watched for a moment, then stepped back into the hall. Herbert lingered a moment longer, then followed. In the hallway, Beatrix spoke first. "She's scared out of her mind, but she's strong. You can see it. Everything she's done has been for those kids." Herbert nodded slowly. "I know." Beatrix narrowed her eyes slightly. "You don't do anything halfway, do you?" He gave a quiet smile. "No point in starting now." Later that afternoon, after the babies were fed again, and Claire had finally allowed herself to lie back down, Herbert sat in the den with a tablet on his lap, not working, just watching, replaying what had happened in his mind. Jessie had always said he held on too tight, that he didn't know when to let go, and maybe she was right. But this didn't feel like holding on. It felt like something else. Like a door slowly creaking open in a part of himself he thought had long since closed. Upstairs, Claire sat on the edge of the bed. Alma was asleep beside her, one hand on her sister's knee. Claire stared at the wallpaper, at the old wooden dresser across the room, at the folded clothes Beatrix had left neatly in a basket. She had no idea where they were going, but for now they weren't on a bench. And the babies were warm, and Alma was safe. She whispered to herself in the dark, almost too soft to hear, "We'll just stay until they're strong enough." And with that, her eyes finally closed. It was the second evening since they had arrived, and though the house was calm, it was not silent. There was the hum of the old radiator in the hallway, the soft creak of wood as the wind moved against the shutters, and somewhere upstairs, the rhythmic breathing of sleeping children. Claire sat at the kitchen table, a mug of lukewarm tea cradled in her hands. She hadn't spoken much since waking, not about what happened, not about what led them there. She'd thanked them repeatedly, her voice hushed and careful, but otherwise had kept to herself. Beatrix moved quietly around the kitchen, chopping carrots for a stew. There was no rush in her movements, only patience. Herbert stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, glancing occasionally at the girl who hadn't yet looked him in the eye since that morning. "You don't need to tell us anything," he said gently, "but if you want to, we're here." Claire looked down at her mug. The steam had faded. She took a breath, long and low, then set the cup down. Her fingers trembled slightly before she folded them in her lap. "My mom's name was Nomsa," she began, her voice flat but steady. "She worked nights, cleaning mostly, sometimes extra shifts at the laundry if they needed. She used to come home with bleach stains on her shoes and bruises on her forearms from the carts." Herbert didn't move. "She was everything," Claire continued. "Tough but kind. The kind of woman who could clean 12 rooms and still come home with enough left in her to sit with me and help spell words I didn't know. We didn't have much, but she made sure I always had a book. Always." Beatrix turned the stove down, letting the pot simmer. "Then she met someone. I was 14. He was good to her at first, not to me, but I thought maybe it would get better. I didn't want to ruin it." Her voice cracked just slightly. She swallowed. "When she got pregnant again, I was already in high school. She was older, and the doctor said it was risky. But she wanted those babies. Said they were a blessing. Said Alma would love having siblings." Herbert stepped closer now, slowly, quietly. "She didn't make it," Claire said. "Ben and Ryan came early. She had a seizure after delivery. They said it was a complication. She never woke up." There was a beat of silence. Only the bubbling pot spoke. "He left the day after the funeral," she said. "Packed a bag and left. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't leave a number. Just walked out. Said he wasn't raising anyone else's kids." Beatrix moved toward her, placing a clean cloth napkin gently on the table. Claire didn't cry. Her face had set into something harder than sorrow. It was the face of someone who had cried long ago and learned that tears didn't solve anything. "I tried to stay in school," she said. "I really did. I had this teacher, Miss Kendrick. She ran the after-school writing program, told me I had something rare, that I could go to college. I even got accepted into a creative summer workshop that year." Her eyes finally lifted, but they didn't meet theirs. She was looking through the past. But the babies needed formula, diapers. Alma needed someone to walk her to preschool. No one else was going to do it. I couldn't work and go to school full time. So I chose. I didn't drop out because I was lazy. I dropped out because I was needed somewhere else. Herbert leaned against the frame of the doorway. He said nothing, just listened. At first I found this little rental in a bad part of town, she went on. Barely had heat, but I made it work. Then rent went up. We moved into a shelter. They were kind, but it was only for 90 days. After that, we had to rotate. Beatrix spoke gently now, and no one from social services helped. Claire shook her head. They said I was technically not the legal guardian. Said they couldn't place us as a unit. They could take the babies into foster care. Maybe Alma, too. But I had to go somewhere else. She looked up now directly at Herbert. Her eyes didn't plead. They dared. So I left. I took them. I figured it was better for us to be together in the cold than apart in a system that doesn't care. Herbert didn't answer right away. His jaw flexed slightly. Beatrix across the room wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the hall. Claire took another breath, shaky this time. I didn't come here to stay. I didn't mean to. I just needed somewhere for them to be warm for a while. Herbert stepped forward, finally picking up her mug and refilling it with hot tea. He placed it back in front of her. You did what anyone would have done, he said, but few could have done it as well as you. She blinked. You don't know me. I don't need to, he said. I see them. I see Alma. And I see what they think of you. That tells me what I need to know. She stared at him for a long moment. Then finally she picked up the mug and took a sip. It wasn't trust, but it was the beginning of something close. The next morning brought a soft drizzle, one of those quiet gray rains that made everything outside look washed and hushed. The kind of weather that made people slow down, made time stretch a little longer. Herbert sat in his study alone, a room wrapped in old mahogany shelves and dust-soft memories. The fire in the hearth flickered low, casting a gentle pulse of light across the aged photos that lined the walls, photos that had not been touched or moved in years. On the desk lay his tablet, open but untouched. His hand hovered over it, unsure whether to press forward or shut it down entirely. He had not expected her name to surface again. Watson. Claire had said it plainly the night before, not knowing that in that moment, a key had turned in the back of his mind. Watson. It tugged at something buried, so he typed it in. Not into a search engine, but into the internal employee archive from the Richardson textile plant, a facility he had sold off almost a decade ago. It was an old habit of his keeping access to records. Not because he was nostalgic, but because in his world, everything had a paper trail. Even people. Especially people. It took longer than it should have to find her. The system was outdated, clunky. But there she was. Nomsa Watson. Hired under a subcontractor. Janitorial night shift. Worked 3 years straight. Never missed a week. He stared at the small ID photo attached to her record. She was younger than he remembered. Slim, tired eyes, tight-lipped smile. There was a familiarity there, in a distance too. Then the memory hit him. Summer. A warm Thursday afternoon. Jessie had been 9, maybe 10. She'd begged him to come to the plant after school so she could see where he really worked. So he'd brought her along for a tour. She got restless halfway through and slipped away from the group, chasing a stray cat into the garden area behind the maintenance wing. He'd panicked when he realized she was gone. But before security could even start their sweep, someone had radioed in. A janitor had pulled a girl from the shallow basin behind the utility shed. The details were sharp now. Jessie's wet sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, her cheeks flushed from crying and embarrassment. And beside her, holding a damp towel to her own arm, was Nomsa Watson. The woman hadn't said much, just kept checking Jessie over, making sure she was really okay. He had thanked her, offered to pay for any damage to her clothes. She had declined. Just said, "She's a brave one, but that water's too cold for a child." Then she went back to work. He hadn't thought about it again until now. He leaned back in his chair, hand moving to his chest, not out of pain, but out of habit. That place. That hollow place that had lived there since Jessie's accident. It had grown quiet over the years. Not healed. Just dormant. 2 years after that day at the factory, Jessie had died in a car crash heading home from college for the holidays. Snow, black ice, a sudden turn. There had been no final words, no goodbye. Only the call, the funeral, the silence. And now, the woman who had once saved his daughter's life had a daughter of her own, sitting downstairs alone with 3 children, fighting the world with the kind of strength Jessie used to admire. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a thread reconnecting itself. He opened the desk drawer, pulling out the photo Jessie had framed herself the week before she left for her freshman year. She had insisted it stay in his study. It was her smiling wide in the garden behind their house, arms raised to the sky as if she had just won something. He whispered aloud to the room, voice rougher than he expected. "She once saved my child. Maybe now it's my turn." Outside, the rain continued, slow and steady. Inside, Herbert closed the drawer and picked up his tablet again, not to search this time, but to write. There were things to review, papers to prepare, arrangements to consider. But more than that, he needed to remember who he had been before the grief, before the wealth hardened into distance. And maybe, just maybe, he needed to let something good grow again from the place where so much had been buried. And in that quiet morning, for the first time in years, the house no longer felt like a museum. It felt like something was beginning. Downstairs, Claire adjusted the blanket on Ryan and watched as Ben sucked calmly on a pacifier. She didn't know what was coming next, but something had shifted, and though she didn't dare hope yet, she allowed herself one small breath of relief. They were still here. They were still together. And maybe, just maybe, they were being seen. The sun rose slower than usual that morning, or at least it felt that way. Light slipped gently through the tall windows of Herbert Richardson's home, painting soft gold onto the quiet hallways. The warmth brought no rush, no chaos, only the still breath of a house slowly waking. In the downstairs kitchen, the clinking of porcelain broke the silence. Claire was there standing at the sink, her hands submerged in warm water as she cleaned a row of baby bottles. Her hair was pulled back hastily with a clip, sleeves damp past the elbows. Ben and Ryan were still asleep upstairs, but Alma was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen tile, whispering stories to a small plush giraffe. Beatrix passed by with a laundry basket, paused at the doorway, and observed quietly. Claire had been in this house for just a week, but her presence was already steadying. She moved like someone used to doing everything without being asked, without expecting praise, without assuming she belonged. "You don't need to do that every morning," Beatrix finally said, voice measured but not unkind. "We have a dishwasher." Claire looked over her shoulder, her smile faint but real. "I don't mind. Gives me something to do while they sleep." Herbert came into the kitchen not long after wearing his usual gray sweater, the kind that looked older than it probably was. He nodded toward the stove. "Smells like Beatrix's doing magic again." "Oatmeal with cinnamon," Beatrix replied, setting down the basket. "Good for babies. Good for grown men who forget breakfast." Claire turned off the water, drying her hands. Alma ran over to her, hugging her waist. "Are we going to school today?" Alma asked, eyes wide, expectant. Claire knelt. "We're going to visit the school. See if it feels right. Then maybe next week you can start." The visit to the nearby public kindergarten was quiet, but not without tension. Claire held Alma's hand tightly as they entered the main office, where a woman with a pale blue blouse and thin spectacles glanced at them over the counter. "Name of the child?" she asked briskly. "Alma Watson," Claire said clearly. "She's 5. And you are her sister, legal guardian at the moment." The woman paused just long enough to make Claire feel the weight of doubt. She typed something into the computer. "We usually require a parent's signature or legal custody documentation. Do you have that?" Claire handed over the necessary forms, some from the shelter, some recent documents she had managed to collect after their mother passed. The woman reviewed them, expression unreadable. "I see. Well, we do have a few seats left. I'll forward this to the principal's assistant." The rest of the visit went smoothly. Alma fell in love with the library immediately. On the way back, Claire carried her in one arm, the other hand balancing a folder of enrollment forms. She didn't say much, but inside she felt something shift, like a breath she'd been holding, finally released. That evening, after the children were asleep, Claire sat alone in the quiet corner of the den. Herbert passed by, paused, then turned back when he saw her typing on the laptop Beatrix had dusted off for her earlier that week. The glow of the screen lit her face in pale blue. Her fingers moved clumsily but determinedly. "What are you working on?" Herbert asked. Claire hesitated. "I'm applying to an adult education program, GED courses. They offer night classes not far from here. You need anything?" "No, I can cover the basics." He didn't press. He watched her a moment longer, nodded, then left. In her quiet, Claire continued typing, backspace typing again. Her application essay was titled, "Why I Stopped and Why I Won't Again." Later that night, Beatrix found her asleep on the couch, laptop still open, essay unfinished but honest. The older woman smiled, pulled a blanket over her, then whispered more to herself than anyone else. "You remind me of someone I used to be." The next morning, Alma announced she had drawn a picture of their new house. It showed 6 people, Claire, Alma, Ben, Ryan, Beatrix, and Herbert holding a book. "That's Mr. Richardson," Alma said proudly. "He reads funny stories." Claire glanced at the drawing, something tightening in her chest. She didn't know what this place would become. She didn't want to assume. But Alma had already made space in her world. That afternoon, Claire mailed her application. No one needed to remind her to do it. No one offered to go with her. She wanted to walk to the mailbox alone. Her steps were quiet but steady, the sky overcast but not threatening. As she slid the envelope in, she whispered something under her breath, a mix of hope, defiance, and prayer. "This time I'll finish what I started." Claire's acceptance letter came folded in a plain white envelope that smelled faintly of toner and hope. The letterhead read City Adult Learning Center, and beneath it the words "Congratulations and welcome" felt both too loud and somehow quiet. She read it alone in the laundry room, holding her breath, her hands still damp from rinsing out Alma's shirt. The paper trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the fragile disbelief of someone unused to good news. Beatrix found her there a few minutes later, the letter still in her hand. "You got in," the older woman said, not asking, just knowing. Claire nodded, and Beatrix gave a small, approving smile before continuing with her basket of towels. "Good. About time something worked in your favor." The following Monday, Claire dressed with a sense of deliberate simplicity. Her jeans were clean and pressed her shirt buttoned up neatly. She tied her braids back, then checked her reflection twice in the mirror, adjusting for presentation rather than vanity. Alma sat cross-legged on the bed behind her eyes full of quiet questions. "So you're really going to school too now?" the little girl asked. Claire nodded. "I am. Will you have homework like me? Probably. Maybe more." Alma grinned, clearly excited by the idea. "Then I'll help you if it's drawing stuff." Claire kissed the top of her head. "Deal." Their morning route took them to Alma's kindergarten first. Claire held her sister's hand tightly as they approached the entrance, a modest red brick building with murals of animals and alphabet letters painted near the door. At the gate stood a uniformed security guard with cropped white hair and a deep-set frown. As Claire approached, he stepped in front of them. "Morning," Claire said politely. "Can I help you?" he asked, not smiling. "I'm dropping off my sister Alma. She just started last week." He looked down at Alma, then back up at Claire. "You her nanny?" Claire stiffened. "No, I'm her sister and guardian." He hesitated, then slowly stepped aside. "All right then, just checking." Inside the building, a teacher greeted Alma warmly while Claire signed a clipboard by the door. On her way out, she could still feel the guard's eyes on her back. The moment followed her all the way to her own school. The City Adult Learning Center was in an old government building, modest and practical. The receptionist barely looked up as Claire handed over her ID and registration form. The woman accepted it, checked her screen, then handed Claire a thick stack of orientation materials. "Room 203, second floor." "You're early," she said. Claire nodded, thanked her, and made her way upstairs. The classroom was half filled with adults of varying ages, most of them white, a few Latino, and just 2 other black students, including Claire. She took a seat near the back, close to a window. A woman in her 50s wearing gold bangles and a floral scarf glanced at her, then shifted her purse to the far side of her chair. Subtle but clear. The instructor walked in 5 minutes later, introducing herself as Mrs. Gentry. She was brisk, efficient, and clearly didn't suffer fools. "We don't grade your past here," she began. "Only your effort from this point on." Claire liked that. She took out a notebook and pen, trying not to let her hand shake. But as she began writing, she heard a whisper behind her. "Bet she got a scholarship from some charity," a woman said, "or a sponsor." Another voice murmured, chuckling. "Sugar daddy, maybe." Claire's grip on her pen tightened, but she said nothing. She kept writing. She had heard worse. This was just more of the same subtle disrespect that wrapped itself in smiles and soft voices. It didn't even bother hiding. That afternoon, Claire returned to the kindergarten to pick up Alma. The same guard from the morning stared at her again. "Back already?" he asked. Claire didn't reply. She walked past him, collected Alma from her teacher, and walked out without a word. But the next day, she was stopped by the administrative assistant at the front office. "We need the legal guardian to sign this form," the woman said, handing Claire a paper with a clipped tone. Claire blinked. "I am her legal guardian." The woman adjusted her glasses. "Yes, but we need confirmation from a parent, or someone with full custody." Claire had already provided those papers, twice. She stared at the woman, then said quietly, Is this about something else? The woman shrugged, feigning ignorance. We just follow protocol. Later, Claire vented to Beatrix while folding laundry. I give them what they ask, and they still make me feel like I don't belong, she said, smoothing out a small t-shirt. Beatrix looked up from her book. That's because they don't expect you to understand the rules, much less follow them better than they do. You're making some folks nervous just by being competent. Claire nodded slowly. She understood. She always had. But it didn't make it easier. That night after the kids had gone to bed, Claire opened her laptop and stared at a blank document. She was supposed to write a personal essay for her class, something about resilience, about what brought her here. The words came slowly, then all at once. They say it takes strength to survive, but strength is not always seen. Sometimes it looks like showing up clean. Sometimes it looks like not raising your voice when you want to scream. Sometimes it looks like filling out every damn form twice so no one can question your right to be somewhere. I didn't get here because someone lifted me. I got here because no one ever did. Resilience is not charity. It is what you build from being looked at like you're stealing something when all you did was show up. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just saved the file, turned off the screen, and sat there a moment, breathing in the silence like it was a kind of protest. And maybe it was. The classroom was unusually quiet that morning, a kind of stillness that seemed to settle between the desks and hang in the corners like dust. Claire sat in her usual seat, notebook on her lap, hands resting on the edge of the desk as if bracing herself for something. Mrs. Gentry, the instructor, walked in with a folder tucked under her arm and a mug of coffee in hand. Her usual clipped tone was gentler today, as if she too felt the weight in the air. She set down her things, looked around the room for a long second, and then said, "Before we begin, I want to read something to you all." She unfolded a printed essay and cleared her throat. Claire knew what was coming the moment she saw the heading on the paper. Her essay, "Resilience is Not Charity." She had turned it in hesitantly, not expecting anything beyond a grade. The fact that it had moved its way from the inbox to the center of the class was something she hadn't anticipated, and now it was happening, every word about to be heard by people who had only seen her skin and made assumptions. Mrs. Gentry read slowly and clearly. She did not dramatize, did not embellish. She let the words speak for themselves. Claire kept her eyes fixed on the pencil in her hand as the room absorbed her truth. She heard no snickers this time, no whispers, just silence, thick, with a kind of unease that wasn't discomfort, but maybe something closer to recognition. The line, "I didn't get here because someone lifted me. I got here because no one ever did," landed with a particular heaviness. When Mrs. Gentry finished, she looked up. "That," she said, tapping the page, "is why we write. That is clarity. That is power." She turned to Claire. "Would you be willing to let me submit this for the citywide writing competition?" Claire blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't written it for attention. She had written it because it was the only way she could breathe that night. "If you think it's worth it," she said quietly, "it is." Mrs. Gentry replied firmly, "More than worth it." Class resumed as usual, but the dynamic had changed. No one looked at Claire the same. She caught the woman in the floral scarf glance at her, then quickly look away. At the end of class, a man in his 40s approached her. "I read your essay," he said. "I judged you when you walked in here. I'm sorry." Claire didn't smile, but she nodded. That was enough. That evening, Claire returned home to the quiet hum of dinner winding down. Beatrix was finishing dishes, and Herbert was reading to Alma, who sat curled up beside him with her favorite blanket. Claire slipped into the kitchen, dropped her bag on the floor, and started drying the last clean bowls with a dish towel. Her fingers moved mechanically, her mind still tangled in the classroom. Beatrix glanced at her. Tough day. Claire exhaled slowly. Not tough, just different. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. After dinner, the house settled into its nightly rhythm. Claire picked up the stray toys from the living room floor, folded the soft blanket that Ryan had dropped, and checked the bottles for the twins one last time. Everything in its place. Everything quiet. She walked into the kitchen and stared at the sink. A single cup still sat in it, half full. She emptied it, turned on the faucet, and began scrubbing it clean, but somewhere between the warm water and the sound of her own breath, the tears began to fall. She didn't sob. She didn't make a sound. But her shoulders trembled and her eyes blurred until the cup was just a shape. Alma walked in barefoot and clutching a stuffed animal. "Claire," she asked softly. Claire turned quickly, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I'm okay, baby." Alma stepped closer, peering up at her. "Are you sad?" Claire knelt down eye level now with her sister. Her voice was gentle, steady, but weighted. "I'm not crying because I'm weak," she said. "I'm crying because I've been strong for so long that sometimes it just breaks through." Alma reached out and hugged her. "I see you," she whispered. Those 3 words knocked the breath out of Claire more than anything else had. Later that week, the instructor announced to the class that Claire's essay had been officially entered in the regional round of the writing contest. A few heads turned. No one scoffed this time. No one made jokes. Claire had spoken the unspeakable, and the room had shifted. It wasn't about pity. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about being seen, finally, clearly. Back at home, Herbert knocked gently on her door one evening, holding a book in one hand. "I found this upstairs," he said. "Jessie loved it. Thought maybe Alma might like it too." Claire took the book, nodded. "Thank you." He lingered a moment, then said, "That essay of yours. I hope you know what you did with that." Claire looked up. "What did I do?" He tilted his head slightly. "You gave truth a backbone. Not many people can do that." She didn't know how to respond, so she simply said, "I needed to say it." Well, he replied, some of us needed to hear it. The world had not changed. The system was still unfair. People still stared, still questioned her place. But inside Claire, something had shifted. The armor she had worn for years had not cracked. It had transformed. She was no longer walking invisible, and more importantly, she wasn't apologizing for being here. Resilience, she realized, was not just endurance. It was clarity. It was knowing that surviving is not weakness, and asking for nothing is not pride. It is simply what people do when they are determined to make a place in a world that constantly tells them they don't belong. And Claire belonged. Every single word had proved it. The late autumn sun cast a pale, hesitant light over the school parking lot, and the wind moved through the trees with the kind of whisper that made everything feel slightly off balance. Claire stood at the edge of the playground fence, waiting for Alma, who had been inside for an extra art session. She had just returned from a quick grocery run, apples, milk, and a small box of crayons Alma had begged for the week before, but Claire couldn't afford until now. Her fingers clutched the brown paper bag against her chest, her breath clouding faintly in the cool air. Then the voice broke the moment. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." She turned and saw the school security guard, Officer Green, a tall man in his late 50s with pale eyes that never blinked as often as they should, and a practiced air of control. Claire blinked, confused. "Is something wrong?" she asked, setting the bag gently on the bench. "We've had an incident. A parent's wallet was reported missing, and someone said you were near the bench earlier." Claire furrowed her brow. "I dropped Alma off and left. I just got back. I haven't been anywhere near the—" "Please don't make this difficult," he said, already signaling to another officer walking toward them. "We're not accusing you. We just need to ask you some questions downtown." Claire looked past him to the school doors. "My sister is still inside. Can I just— We've already made arrangements. Someone from staff will make sure she gets picked up." The handcuffs didn't come out, but the message was loud and clear. "You are being treated like a suspect. Not a guardian. Not a sister. Not a student. Not someone." That night, Beatrix picked up Alma, Ben, and Ryan. She didn't say much to the teacher, just that something had come up. Alma kept asking where Claire was, and Beatrix only said she'd see her soon, even though her heart raced with a quiet kind of fury. At the precinct, Claire sat under flickering fluorescent lights for hours. No one shouted at her. No one slammed tables. They were calm, cold, detached. They asked the same questions multiple times. Where had she been? Did she notice anyone acting strange? Had she ever spoken to the woman who lost the wallet? Did she know what color the wallet was? Did she often hang around school benches? Claire answered everything truthfully. She had receipts. She had timestamps from the grocery store. She had nothing to hide. But the officers didn't seem to care. They didn't accuse. They suggested. They repeated. They implied. She was released just after 9 o'clock, exhausted and shaky. The moment she stepped outside, her phone buzzed. Missed calls from Beatrix. A text from Alma. "Are you okay? I drawed you a picture." The next morning, the local news station ran a quiet headline. Community concern police look into theft at local school. Caregiver questioned. They didn't name her. They didn't have to. The photograph was a blurry, zoomed shot of Claire walking from the building, shoulders tense, paper bag still in hand. The caption beneath didn't say her name, but the story was already moving. At the breakfast table, Herbert read the article twice, his hands trembling. Beatrix kept her eyes on the eggs she was stirring. Claire hadn't come downstairs yet. "I'm going down there," Herbert said quietly. Beatrix looked up. "They've already let her go, no charges." "That's not the point." Claire finally emerged, hair pulled back tightly, circles under her eyes. She didn't look at the newspaper. She looked at the children, kissed Alma's head, took Ben from his high chair and pressed her cheek to his. Herbert stood up. "Claire, I'm fine," she said. Her voice was calm but flat. "They had to check. It's done." "It's not done," Herbert replied, and his voice had an edge Claire hadn't heard since that first night she met him. "This isn't justice. This is character assassination." Claire met his gaze. "No, this is reality." The silence stretched. Ben babbled softly in her arms. Finally, Claire spoke again, quieter. "They didn't even see me." "Not really. They saw what I might be, what they've been told to look for, what they're afraid of." Herbert's fists clenched at his sides. He turned, grabbed his coat. "Where are you going?" Claire asked. "To make them see you." He did not explain further, but when he returned later that afternoon, he had already spoken to 2 lawyers. He had already drafted a formal letter demanding a retraction from the media outlet, and he had scheduled a private meeting with the school board. Still, none of that erased the damage. At the school pickup the next day, other parents looked at Claire too long or too quickly. Some smiled too brightly, others crossed the street. A teacher hesitated before handing Alma's folder to her. The weight didn't lift. It simply redistributed. Now it sat in the corners of her thoughts, in the way she straightened her clothes before going out, in how she prepared answers to questions no one had asked yet. Alma sensed it too. That night, after dinner, the little girl climbed onto Claire's lap while Claire was staring into a half-finished email on her laptop. "Are you okay?" Alma whispered. Claire nodded, but it was slow. Alma placed a folded sheet of paper in her hand. It was a drawing, Claire standing between Alma and the twins, all of them holding hands. Behind them, a shadowy figure. Claire turned the page over. "I drew that lady from school too," Alma said. "The one who looked mad. But I didn't give her a face." Claire smiled faintly, pulled Alma in close. Her voice when she spoke again was barely above a murmur. "Sometimes people don't see your face anyway. They just make one up for you." Alma's small arms tightened around her. This part of the story didn't end with triumph. It didn't end with applause, but it shifted something. It put a name to what Claire had carried for so long. And when Herbert sat at his desk that evening, pulling out old folders preparing statements, he did so not just as a man of wealth, but as a man who understood now that silence, even polite silence, was complicity. He would not be silent again, and neither would Claire. It began with the silence of a man who had once lost everything and was now learning piece by piece what it meant to stand up, not just in private, but in front of the world. The morning after Claire's release from the station, Herbert sat at the edge of his study couch with the television muted. His hand, weathered, infirm, rested on a letter, a printed piece from the local tabloid. It read without subtlety, "Young caregiver question in theft still under inquiry." There was no mention of her innocence, no correction, no apology, only a shadow. Herbert Richardson had built an empire by choosing his words carefully, but now silence felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, harder than any heart attack ever had. Beatrix found him there, sitting motionless, the morning sunlight streaking across his shoulders. Her eyes caught the headline before he even lifted his. He didn't look at her when he said, "They took her name. I won't let them keep it." Later that week, he made calls, not to his assistants, not to PR firms, but to people who still owed him favors that mattered. A small, independent broadcast outlet was invited to his estate. No formal press room, just a long oak dining table, 5 chairs, and 1 microphone placed in front of a grandfather clock that hadn't ticked since Jesse died. Claire didn't want to be there. She told him as much the night before in hushed tones over the sink as she dried Alma's lunchbox. "You don't need to do this for me. They'll just say you're overstepping." He had paused, towel in hand, and said simply, "It's not about you. It's about what they think they can do to you. I can't let that pass." On the day of the announcement, Herbert wore a charcoal suit, nothing flashy. His tie was slightly uneven, and Beatrix fixed it at the door with trembling fingers. Alma watched from behind the hallway, holding Ben in one arm and trying to shush Ryan, who had just discovered the power of his own voice. Claire sat in the back corner of the room, not on camera, but close enough to hear every word. When the cameras rolled, Herbert didn't read from a paper. He spoke as if confessing. "My name is Herbert Richardson. Some of you know me as a businessman. Fewer of you knew me as a father. My daughter, Jessie, was taken from me years ago, and since then I have lived a quiet life. Too quiet. 2 months ago, I found a young woman and 3 children in a park nearly frozen. I brought them into my home, not because I'm a saint, not because I wanted praise, because they were human beings in need, and no one else had stopped." He took a breath, his voice steady, but slower now. "Claire Watson is not a suspect. She is not a criminal. She is not a charity case. She is the sister of Alma, Ben, and Ryan. She is their guardian, their protector, and the fiercest woman I have had the honor of knowing. And as of today, I am filing for guardianship of the children, not to replace her, but to protect them all. Because in this country, sometimes a signature from someone who looks like me is the difference between being heard and being dismissed." Gasps were heard even from the small crew present, but he wasn't done. The police did not apologize. The news did not retract. "And I will not stand by while this family's name is dragged through dirt for the crime of existing in the wrong skin, in the wrong zip code." He ended with a final statement, looking straight into the lens. "When I lost my daughter, I did nothing but grieve. This time, I will grieve forward. I will not lose another child to indifference." That evening, the clip went viral, not on major news, but on social media, through teachers, nurses, retired veterans, and local activists. It reached Claire's old writing teacher, who left a comment under the video. She always had the words. Now, someone gave her the microphone. Claire read it in the kitchen, blinking back tears she didn't want to explain. The backlash from the station's mishandling began small. A few community members questioned the school's lack of oversight. Some parents even sent notes of apology. But what struck Claire most wasn't the public response. It was Alma who whispered during bedtime, "Why do they think you're bad when you're the best person I know?" Claire didn't answer right away. She tucked Alma in, stroked her braids flat, and said quietly, "Because sometimes people believe stories that hurt more than they believe the truth." She found Herbert later sitting in his favorite chair by the fireplace, reading a folder of documents for the guardianship filing. She asked him the question she had been holding in for days. "Why did you really do it?" He closed the folder, looked at her not as a benefactor, but as someone who had made his own peace with pain. "Because when Jessie was dying, I stood there and said nothing. I told myself it was enough to love her, but it wasn't. She needed me to speak, and I stayed silent. I won't make that mistake again." They sat in the quiet, not needing more words. For the first time in years, Herbert felt like a man whose voice mattered not for business, but for something deeply human. Claire, still reeling from the scars of that accusation, didn't smile, but she stood a little straighter, her jaw a little firmer, as if the words he spoke had filled in something hollow that the system had tried to carve out. She wasn't healed, but she had been seen, and this time the world had been forced to look back. Claire didn't want the attention. Not the camera crews outside the house, not the emails from reporters begging for a quote, not the phone calls with promises of interviews, book deals, speaking engagements. She had never asked to be a symbol, but when people hear your name on television more than their own, the world begins to shape you into something it can define. And right now, the world had decided Claire was a survivor, a hero, and Claire wasn't sure if she wanted to carry that weight. The house had quieted again after the press conference. Herbert had retreated to his study, exhausted but proud. Beatrix was busy keeping the twins from drawing on the new wallpaper. Alma was curled up on the couch watching cartoons, her little hand resting gently on Claire's knee. Outside, the garden swayed in the afternoon wind. It was supposed to feel like a victory, but Claire felt like she had stepped into someone else's shoes. Later that week, the invitation arrived, a neatly printed envelope sealed in gold trim. Claire opened it slowly, almost afraid it might be another tabloid threat or some exploitative offer. But it wasn't. It was from a regional conference on education reform, inviting her to speak on a panel about equity in schools. Claire stared at the paper for a long time. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She tucked it under the sugar jar in the kitchen and went back to folding laundry. It was Beatrix who brought it up again 2 days later. "You know," the older woman said gently as she buttoned Ryan's onesie, "when my brother got drafted, he told me fear doesn't mean you're not brave. It just means you're paying attention." Claire raised her eyes. "It's not fear," she said softly. I don't want them to think I'm okay with all this. That being turned into someone inspirational makes up for what they did." Beatrix nodded. "Then maybe you should tell them that." That night, Claire took out the invitation again. She read it aloud. Alma, sitting at the table drawing a picture of their family, looked up. "Are you going to go, Claire?" Claire hesitated. "Maybe. I don't know if I have anything to say." "You do," Alma said firmly. "You always tell me what's true even if it hurts. Maybe they need that too." Claire looked at her little sister, at the fierce intelligence behind those brown eyes, and nodded. She picked up a pen. The day of the event was cloudy. Claire wore a simple gray blouse and black pants. No makeup, no stylist, no spectacle, just herself. Herbert drove her to the venue. They sat in silence most of the way. When they pulled up outside, he turned to her. "You don't have to be what they want you to be. Just tell your truth." Claire took a breath, nodded, and stepped out. The auditorium was modest but full. Teachers' parents, advocates. Claire sat at the end of the panel beside a former superintendent and a university dean. When it was her turn to speak, the moderator introduced her as an example of resilience. Claire walked to the podium. The microphone buzzed slightly. She cleared her throat. "Thank you for the invitation. I know some of you came to hear a story of triumph, something uplifting, maybe even something that makes you feel a little better about the world. But I'm not here to be your inspiration. I'm here because I survived something that never should have happened. And I want to make sure no one else has to survive it the way I did." A hush fell across the room. Claire continued. "I dropped out of school to raise my siblings after our mother died. I lived in shelters. I begged for jobs I was too young to get. I carried my brother on my back because I couldn't afford a stroller, and when someone accused me of stealing, they didn't ask questions. They just saw my skin, my clothes, my presence, and decided I fit the story in their heads." Her voice did not shake, though her hands did. "So don't make me an example. Make better policies. Make room for mothers in classrooms. Make transportation safe. Make counselors available. Make it easier for kids like me to stay in school. That's how you honor stories like mine, by making sure they don't have to be repeated." She stepped back. No dramatic music, no applause for several seconds. Then someone stood. Then another. The room rose slowly, not in cheer, but in something quieter. Respect, understanding, a recognition that this wasn't a performance. Back home, Claire found Alma waiting in the hallway holding another drawing. This one showed their whole family again, but Jessie wasn't in the clouds anymore. She was gone. In her place were Claire, the twins, Alma, Beatrix, and Herbert. Claire looked at it and asked gently, "No Jessie today?" Alma shook her head. She said she could rest now. Claire swallowed. A single tear slid down her cheek. "And you, little one," Alma smiled. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Claire. You can just be my sister again." Claire knelt and hugged her tightly. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel peace, not because the world had changed, but because she had chosen, finally, not to carry it all alone. That night, Herbert knocked gently on her door. "May I?" Claire nodded. He stepped in. "I watched the live stream." She didn't answer. "I thought you were powerful and honest. Jessie would have been proud." Claire looked at him, and for the first time since the press conference, she let herself believe it. It had been exactly 1 year since Claire stood on that stage, trembling, but unshaken, refusing to be reduced to a symbol. Now the light filtering through the windows of their modest but warm home painted quiet proof that healing did not always arrive with thunder. It arrived with lunchboxes packed at dawn, laughter echoing from the hallway, and the soft rustling of textbooks opened after dinner. Claire, now a sophomore studying social work, balanced her schedule with a clarity that surprised even her. Her days began early, reviewing lecture notes with Alma beside her at the kitchen table, the younger girl practicing spelling, while Claire highlighted passages on community policy. The twins, Ben and Ryan, were just beginning to speak in short sentences, often climbing onto her lap mid-study with sticky fingers and toothy grins. She never pushed them away. She just smiled, kissed their heads, and adjusted her focus. Multitasking was no longer survival, it was living. Alma had adjusted to elementary school beautifully. Her teachers described her as observant, quick to help others, and fiercely imaginative. One particular drawing she brought home weeks earlier still hung proudly on the fridge, a bright, almost chaotic blend of crayon strokes forming a family portrait. There was Claire, drawn taller than anyone else, one arm stretched around Ben and Ryan, the other around Alma. Beside them, Beatrix, smiling wide in an apron, stood holding a tray of muffins. And next to her, holding everyone in view, was Herbert in his trademark sweater vest glasses resting on his nose. In the sky above them floated a soft blue silhouette Jessie with outstretched arms and a heart glowing in her chest. Claire stared at that drawing often, unsure if it brought more tears or strength. Herbert, now recovering from a successful heart surgery, had shown signs of age more rapidly over the past months. The silver in his hair had taken full residence, and the lines across his face deepened, not from burden, but from the kind of smiling that wasn't practiced for decades. He was slower now, often needing assistance walking across longer stretches of the house, but still insisted on making the morning oatmeal himself. When Claire offered to help, he would say, half joking, "I'm not dead yet, child. Let me feel useful." Claire was the one who signed the surgical consent form when the day finally came. Legally, Herbert had already finalized the paperwork to adopt the children. Claire, now 21, was not his dependent, but had been granted medical decision rights under an advance directive Herbert himself filed. In that sterile hospital waiting room, when the doctor explained the risks, Claire's fingers tightened around the pen. She signed her name slowly, as if imprinting the weight of everything he had done for them into the ink. Beatrix remained a constant presence. Her transition from housekeeper to something resembling family had been so seamless, no one even remarked upon it anymore. She treated the children like her own grandchildren, showed up at Claire's class presentations when she could, and baked more than anyone could eat. When Claire once asked her why she stayed even after her scheduled retirement, Beatrix said, "Because love doesn't clock out." One late spring afternoon, as the family prepared for their first professional portrait session, chaos broke out in the most ordinary way. Ben refused to wear the button-up shirt Claire laid out. Ryan smeared peanut butter on his collar. Alma couldn't find the purple hairband she insisted was lucky. Claire, slightly frantic, chased shoes under the couch while Beatrix tried to convince Alma that blue looked just as magical. Herbert, sitting in the corner with his cane leaning against the armrest, let out a chuckle so deep it silenced the room. "You know," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I used to think wealth was peace and quiet, but I was wrong. This right here, this mayhem, this love, this noise, this is the richest I've ever been." They took the photo that day with the boys on Claire's lap, Alma leaning on Beatrix's side, and Herbert seated in the center, one hand resting lightly on Claire's shoulder. There was no symmetry, no posed smiles, just light laughter and 1,000 stories in every wrinkle and glance. That night, after the kids were asleep and Beatrix had turned in early, Claire stood alone in the kitchen. She held the printed photograph fresh from the envelope and stared at it in silence. Then, without hesitation, she reached for a magnet and pinned it to the fridge, above the old drawing, not replacing it, but adding to it. Herbert stepped in quietly, his slippers making soft sounds on the floor. "You did good today," he said. Claire turned toward him, her eyes softer than usual. "So did you. You kept your shirt clean." He laughed, then grew serious. "Claire, do you ever regret it not walking away that first day?" She looked at him, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Then she shook her head slowly. "No, because I didn't stay out of pity. I stayed because you saw us, and I never forgot what that felt like." He stepped closer, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Some people are saved by angels. We were saved by someone who stayed." She smiled, but didn't speak. There was nothing to add. Outside, the night was quiet. Inside, life was full. There was no magic ending, no grand reward, just a family who chose again and again to show up for one another. And sometimes that was more than enough. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment of this story. If something in it stirred you even a little, that means you felt what we hope to share, not just sorrow or struggle, but healing dignity and the power of a second chance when someone refuses to turn away. We know that stories like Claire's and Herbert's aren't just fiction. They echo real lives, real families, and real acts of quiet courage. So before you go, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? What part of their story stayed with you most? We read every word, and we invite you to share yours, because belonging is built when voices rise together. And if this story meant something to you, stay close. The next chapter is coming.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.